The morning sun cast golden reflections across Newport Bay Harbor as Marcus Johnson adjusted his new uniform collar. At 42 years old, with salt and pepper hair and shoulders, strong from years of maritime work, he stood tall despite his nerves. This was his first day as the senior dock manager at one of California's most prestigious marinas, and he wanted everything to be perfect. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a worn leather briefcase containing certificates from his 15 years of marina experience. The security guard, Tom, greeted him with a friendly smile and handed him his new ID badge. "The morning shift starts in 20 minutes, Tom said, pointing towards the main office. "Mrs. Patterson is waiting for you." The marina office smelled of coffee and sea air. Sandra Patterson, the marina's general manager, was a short woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She spent the next hour showing Marcus around the facility, introducing him to the morning staff, and explaining their high-end clientele's special requirements. "We have over 50 luxury yachts docked here permanently," Mrs. Patterson explained, her heels clicking on the wooden boardwalk. "Most owners are pleasant, but," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "some require extra attention." Marcus nodded confidently. He had handled demanding clients throughout his career at other prestigious marinas in San Diego and Miami. His previous employer's glowing recommendations proved his ability to manage both boats and their particular owners. As they walked down Doca, the marina's most exclusive berth, Mrs. Patterson pointed out various vessels and mentioned their owners' preferences. Marcus took mental notes, already planning how to exceed their expectations. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until they reached the largest yacht in the marina, a gleaming 120-foot Benehi named Wellington's Pride. "And this," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice dropping slightly, "belongs to Mr. Richard Wellington. He's very particular about his vessel's care." Just then, a tall man in expensive sailing clothes appeared on the yacht's deck. Richard Wellington, around 60 with perfectly groomed gray hair, looked down at them with cold blue eyes, his gaze fixed on Marcus, and his expression shifted from neutral to dismissive in an instant. "Patterson," Wellington called out, ignoring Marcus completely. "I thought I made it clear that I expect to be consulted about any staff changes affecting my berth." Mrs. Patterson straightened her spine. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington. Yes, I'm currently introducing our new senior dock manager, Marcus Johnson. He comes highly recommended with 15 years of experience." "I don't care if he has 50 years of experience," Wellington interrupted, his voice sharp. "I have specific standards for who handles my vessel." His eyes finally moved to Marcus, looking him up and down with obvious disdain. Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, though his chest tightened. He had encountered this type of prejudice before, but it never got easier. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington," he said calmly. "I assure you that your yacht will receive the highest standard of care under my supervision." Wellington's face hardened. "We'll see about that," he replied coldly. "Patterson, I expect you in my office at noon. We need to discuss this situation." With that, he turned and disappeared into his yacht's cabin. Mrs. Patterson's face had reddened with embarrassment. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. Mr. Wellington can be difficult, but—" "It's all right, Mrs. Patterson," Marcus interrupted gently. "I understand." And he did understand, all too well. This wasn't his first encounter with someone like Wellington, and it probably wouldn't be his last. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of introductions and training. Marcus met his team of dock workers, memorized the marina's emergency procedures, and began learning the complex scheduling system for the fuel dock. His new colleagues seemed friendly and competent, though he noticed a few exchanging worried glances after Wellington's display. By lunchtime, Marcus had already started implementing small improvements to the dock's organization system. He focused on his work, pushing the morning's unpleasant encounter to the back of his mind. As he reviewed maintenance schedules in his new office, he could see Wellington's Pride through the window, gleaming in the sunlight. Marcus sighed quietly, realizing that managing this particular yacht and its owner would be his greatest challenge yet, but he hadn't worked his way up through the ranks of the maritime industry by backing down from challenges. He straightened the stack of papers on his desk and smiled slightly. Sometimes the biggest obstacles led to the most important changes, though he couldn't have known then just how true that would prove to be. 2 weeks into his new position at Newport Bay Harbor, Marcus Johnson developed a new morning routine. He'd arrived at the marina an hour before sunrise, giving himself extra time to inspect Wellington's Pride before its owner's inevitable morning inspection. The early autumn air was crisp as he walked down Doca, his footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. Marcus shone his flashlight carefully over the yacht's pristine hull, checking for any imperfections. He had learned quickly that Richard Wellington would find something to complain about, no matter how perfect things appeared. Yesterday, it had been about water spots on the windows. The day before, Wellington had claimed the fenders were hanging 2 inches too low. Johnson, the sharp voice cut through the morning silence. Wellington stood at the end of the dock, dressed in expensive workout clothes, his face already set in a scowl. "What do you think you're doing around my boat at this hour?" Marcus turned calmly, keeping his voice steady. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington. I'm conducting the standard morning inspection as per marina protocol." Wellington marched down the dock, his leather boat shoes making angry slapping sounds. "Protocol? Let me show you what your protocol has done." He pointed to a spot on the hull. "Look at these scratches." Marcus moved closer, shining his light where Wellington pointed. The hull was flawless. He had personally supervised its cleaning the previous evening. "Sir, I don't see any." "Are you calling me a liar?" Wellington's voice rose sharply. "First you damaged my boat, and now you're suggesting I'm making things up?" By now, other early morning workers had started to gather at a safe distance. Marcus could see Tom, the security guard, watching with concern from his post. This had become an almost daily spectacle. "Mr. Wellington," Marcus replied professionally, "I assure you that your yacht receives our highest standard of care. If you'd like, we can review the maintenance logs and security footage." "I don't need to review anything," Wellington interrupted. "What I need is competent staff who know how to handle luxury vessels. I'll be speaking with Mrs. Patterson about this, again." As Wellington stormed off toward the marina office, Marcus's colleague Steve approached him. "That's the third time this week," Steve said quietly. "You know he doesn't treat any of us like that." Marcus nodded, well aware that Wellington was perfectly pleasant with the marina's white staff members. "It's all right, Steve. Let's just focus on our work." But focusing on work became increasingly difficult as Wellington's complaints escalated. During the afternoon fuel dock scheduling, Wellington appeared again, this time claiming Marcus had deliberately delayed his refueling appointment. The fact that Wellington hadn't even made a refueling request didn't seem to matter. Later that day, while Marcus was training new dock attendants on emergency procedures, Wellington approached Mrs. Patterson within ear. He wondered how long this situation could continue before something had to give. 1 month into Marcus's employment at Newport Bay Harbor, the marina's regular customers began to notice something disturbing. Mrs. Chen, owner of a sleek sailing yacht, sat at the marina's cafe with her friend Barbara, watching the morning's activities with growing concern. They observed as Wellington cheerfully greeted Steve, a white dock attendant, with a friendly pat on the back and casual conversation about the weather. Just 10 minutes later, the same Wellington harshly criticized Marcus for supposedly improper dockline handling, despite Marcus's technique being textbook perfect. "Did you see that?" Mrs. Chen whispered to Barbara, pulling out her phone to record the interaction. "It's like he becomes a completely different person when he deals with Marcus." Barbara nodded, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I've been keeping a log on my phone. In the past week alone, Wellington has filed 4 complaints about Marcus, but praised every other staff member, even the new trainee who actually did scratch his hull during practice docking." The pattern became impossible to ignore. During busy weekends, Wellington would jovially chat with white boat owners and staff members, sharing fishing stories and offering expensive cigars. But his demeanor would instantly change when Marcus appeared, becoming cold, hostile, and accusatory. Jack Peterson, a retired judge who kept his family boat at the marina, started documenting these incidents more formally. As he explained to his wife one evening, "In my 30 years on the bench, I've seen this kind of targeted harassment before. Someone needs to stand up, but it has to be done right." On a particularly busy Saturday, Wellington's behavior reached new levels of obvious discrimination. The morning began with him complimenting Tracy, the White Office administrator, on her excellent handling of his billing questions. An hour later, He loudly berated Marcus for using the exact same billing procedure with another client. During the afternoon rush, Wellington's true colors showed even more clearly. When Tim, a white dock worker, helped adjust his yacht's power connection, Wellington thanked him with a generous tip. But when Marcus performed a required safety inspection of the same power system later that day, Wellington accused him of tampering with the equipment. The other boat owners exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some began recording these interactions on their phones, while others took notes. Mrs. Chen approached Marcus during a quiet moment. "We can see what's happening," she said softly. "Many of us are documenting everything. We want to help, but we're not sure how to do it without making things worse for you." Marcus appreciated their concern but felt caught in a difficult position. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," he replied professionally. "I'm just focusing on doing my job to the best of my ability." Behind the scenes, a network of concerned marina members began sharing their observations. They created a private group chat to document incidents, complete with dates, times, and witnesses. Jack Peterson kept all this information organized, his legal background helping him understand what might be useful if things ever escalated to formal action. Even the younger boat owners got involved. College student Mike Thompson, whose parents owned a small yacht, started using his TikTok account to subtly document the contrasting ways Wellington treated different staff members. Though he never posted the videos publicly out of respect for Marcus's privacy, he kept them as evidence. By the end of the month, the pattern was undeniable. Wellington had filed 27 complaints about Marcus, while praising every other staff member. He had accused Marcus of damage or improper behavior 18 times, all of which were proven false by security footage. The marina's security cameras had captured over 30 instances of Wellington's dramatically different treatment of Marcus compared to white employees. Despite this mounting evidence, marina management felt trapped. Wellington's influence in the local boating community was significant, and his hefty docking fees helped keep the marina profitable. Mrs. Patterson, the general manager, struggled with the situation, knowing what was happening was wrong but feeling powerless to address it without risking the marina's financial stability. As another sunset painted the sky over Newport Bay Harbor, Marcus sat in his office reviewing the day's logs. He could see small groups of boat owners gathered on their decks, talking in hushed tones and glancing toward Wellington's pride. The community's awareness was growing, their discomfort rising, but no one knew quite how to break this cycle of harassment. What no one realized yet was that the solution would come from the most unexpected source, someone who had the power to make Wellington finally face the truth about his behavior. The annual Newport Bay Harbor Summer Festival brought chaos to the usually orderly marina. Visiting boats filled every available slip, and the docks bustled with activity. Marcus had spent weeks preparing for this weekend, creating detailed schedules and safety protocols to handle the increased traffic. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Marcus arrived at 5 a.m. to oversee final preparations, knowing this would be his most challenging day yet at the marina. He had assigned his best staff to manage the festival's boat parade, while he personally supervised the main dock where Wellington's Pride was moored. Everything ran smoothly until mid-morning, when Wellington stormed out of his yacht, his face red with anger. "Johnson," he shouted, drawing attention from nearby festival visitors. "What have you done to my navigation system?" Marcus approached calmly, though his heart was pounding. "Excuse me, Mr. Wellington?" "Don't play innocent," Wellington snarled, pointing at his yacht. "My entire navigation system is down. It was working perfectly yesterday, and you were the last person near my boat last night during rounds." A small crowd began to gather. Mrs. Chen and Judge Peterson, who had been documenting Wellington's behavior, moved closer while pretending to check their own boats. "Mr. Wellington," Marcus replied professionally, "I haven't been near your navigation equipment. During night rounds, we only check external security features. We never enter any vessels without owner permission." "Liar!" Wellington's voice echoed across the water. "You've been trying to sabotage me since you started here. This equipment costs more than you make in a year. You'll pay for every cent of damage." Mrs. Patterson hurried down the dock, her heels clicking rapidly on the wooden planks. "What seems to be the problem here?" Wellington turned to her, his voice dripping with accusations. "This man has deliberately sabotaged my yacht's navigation system. I want him fired immediately, and I'll be pressing criminal charges." Marcus maintained his composure, though his hands were shaking slightly. Mrs. Patterson, I respectfully suggest we review the security footage. The cameras cover every angle of Mr. Wellington's yacht, including the access points. Of course he wants to check the cameras, Wellington sneered. He probably tampered with those too. Tom, the security guard, stepped forward. Sir, our camera system is on a separate secure network. No one can tamper with the footage. I can pull it up right now on my tablet. The gathered crowd watched as Tom accessed the security system. The night's footage clearly showed that no one had entered Wellington's yacht. In fact, the only person seen boarding the vessel was Wellington himself, late the previous evening with what appeared to be a bottle in his hand. Mrs. Patterson viewed the footage carefully. Mr. Wellington, the video evidence shows that Marcus never entered your vessel. Perhaps we should have our marine electronics specialist take a look at the system. This is ridiculous. Wellington's face had turned an even darker shade of red. Are you all conspiring against me now? I know what I saw. Just then, Steve, one of the white dock workers, approached hesitantly. Mr. Wellington, I think I might know what happened. When I was helping you dock yesterday, I noticed you had left your radar on. With all the festival boats' electronics running, sometimes that can cause system overload if it's left on overnight. Wellington's expression flickered between rage and embarrassment. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and several people were openly recording the scene on their phones. Mrs. Patterson tried to defuse the situation. Mr. Wellington, why don't we have our technician check the system? I'm sure we can resolve this quickly. But Wellington wasn't finished. He turned back to Marcus, jabbing a finger toward his chest. This isn't over, Johnson. One way or another, I'll make sure you're gone from this marina. As Wellington stormed off, Mrs. Patterson pulled Marcus aside. I'm so sorry about this, Marcus. We'll document the incident, but, she paused, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Wellington is our highest-paying client, and with his connections to the harbor board. Marcus understood what she wasn't saying. The marina wouldn't take any real action against Wellington, despite the clear evidence of his behavior. This was the breaking point. The moment Marcus realized that even with proof, even with witnesses, nothing would change unless something dramatic happened. As he watched Wellington's retreating figure, Marcus felt a weight settle in his chest. He had built his career on professionalism and excellence, but now he wondered if that would ever be enough to overcome some people's prejudices. What no one knew then was that fate had already set in motion events that would change everything, starting with a phone call to Wellington's daughter Sarah, who had watched the whole scene unfold through one of the festival's live streaming cameras. Sarah Wellington sat in her San Francisco law office, staring at her computer screen in horror. She had been watching the Newport Bay Harbor Festival's live stream to see her father's yacht in the boat parade, but instead witnessed his shocking confrontation with Marcus Johnson. The daughter of Richard Wellington was nothing like her father. At 24, she had already made a name for herself as a civil rights attorney, fighting against the very kind of discrimination she now saw her father displaying. I can't believe this, she muttered, downloading the video footage. Her assistant, Jenny, poked her head in the door. Everything okay, Sarah? You look upset. Sarah shook her head. My father, I need to take a few days off. I'm going to Newport Bay. She began quickly packing her laptop and legal notepad. Within an hour, she was on the road, driving her modest hybrid car south toward the marina. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Newport Bay Harbor just as the sun was rising. She hadn't told her father she was coming. Instead, she parked her car and walked quietly down the dock, watching Marcus perform his morning inspections. His careful attention to detail and professional demeanor were obvious, even from a distance. Sarah approached him slowly. Mr. Johnson? Marcus turned, immediately recognizing her from photos displayed in Wellington's Pride. His expression became guarded. Good morning, Miss Wellington. How can I help you? Please call me Sarah, she said quickly. And I'm not here on my father's behalf. In fact, she took a deep breath. I'm here because I saw what happened yesterday. I've been watching the live stream footage, and some visitors send me more videos. This isn't the first incident, is it? Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Miss Wellington, I appreciate your concern, but... I'm a civil rights attorney, Sarah interrupted gently. And before you worry, yes, he's my father. That doesn't mean I support his behavior. I've spent my career fighting against discrimination. I never thought I'd be fighting it in my own family. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Chen, who approached cautiously. When she realized who Sarah was, she straightened her spine. Are you here to make more trouble for Marcus? Because many of us have been documenting everything. Sarah turned to her eagerly. You have documentation? Would you be willing to share it with me? Mrs. Chen looked surprised but quickly recovered. You're really here to help? I am, Sarah confirmed. What my father is doing is wrong. It's illegal, and more importantly, it's morally reprehensible. I can't stand by and watch this continue. Over the next few hours, Sarah met with various boat owners who had been recording Wellington's behavior. Judge Peterson shared his carefully organized records, and Mrs. Chen showed her the group chat where marina members had been documenting incidents. Even Tom, the security guard, provided access to relevant security footage. By afternoon, Sarah had filled her legal notepad with notes and witness statements. She sat in the marina's cafe, reviewing everything, when she heard her father's voice booming across the dock. This line isn't tight enough. Wellington was shouting at Marcus. Do you have any idea what you're doing? Sarah watched as Marcus calmly demonstrated that the line was secured to proper specifications. Her father's face grew red as other boat owners began to gather, many openly recording the interaction on their phones. Enough, Sarah whispered to herself, standing up. She had seen enough. As a lawyer, she knew the evidence was overwhelming. As a daughter, she knew what she had to do. She walked toward her father's yacht, her legal training and moral conviction giving her strength. Wellington saw her approaching and his angry expression changed to surprise. Sarah, what are you doing here? I didn't know you were coming to visit. I'm not here to visit, Dad, she said firmly. We need to talk about your treatment of Mr. Johnson and your behavior at this marina. Wellington's face darkened. This doesn't concern you, Sarah. This is business. No, Dad, she replied, her voice steady. This is discrimination. This is harassment, and it ends now. The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as father and daughter faced each other on the dock. Sarah stood tall, her legal notepad in one hand and her phone with its standing video evidence in the other. No one had ever challenged Richard Wellington like this before, and certainly not his own daughter. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything at Newport Bay Harbor. The Newport Bay Harbor's annual member dinner couldn't have provided a more perfect setting for what was about to unfold. The yacht club's main dining room was filled with boat owners, marina staff, and local maritime officials. Richard Wellington sat at his usual prominent table, holding court with several influential members of the harbor board. Sarah Wellington had spent the day preparing for this moment. She wore her courtroom suit and carried a thick folder of evidence. Marcus had tried to talk her out of making a public scene, but Sarah knew her father. Private conversations wouldn't work. He needed to face his actions in front of the community he so desperately wanted to impress. As the dinner's first course was being served, Sarah stood up from her table. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear and strong. Excuse me, everyone. I have something I need to address. The room gradually fell silent. Wellington looked up, his expression changing from annoyance to concern when he saw his daughter standing there. Sarah, sit down, he hissed. This isn't the time or place. Actually, Dad, this is exactly the time and place, Sarah replied, her voice carrying across the now quiet room, because everyone here needs to hear this. She opened her folder and pulled out her phone. For the past 2 months, Mr. Marcus Johnson has faced constant harassment at this marina. I have documented 43 separate incidents of discriminatory behavior, all targeted specifically at him. Wellington's face reddened. Sarah, that's enough. But Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. I have video evidence of 37 occasions where the same person treated white staff members with respect while verbally abusing Mr. Johnson minutes later. She pressed play on her phone, and Wellington's voice filled the room, showing the stark contrast in his behavior. The dinner guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Chen and Judge Peterson sat up straighter, ready to support Sarah's claims. Tom, the security guard, stood near the door, arms crossed, watching intently. I have written statements from 12 marina members, Sarah continued, pulling out more documents, all describing the same pattern of targeted harassment. I have security footage showing that every single complaint filed against Mr. Johnson was false. Wellington stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous. I won't sit here and be accused. No, Dad, Sarah cut him off firmly. For once, you're going to listen. These aren't accusations. These are facts. Facts captured on video, documented by witnesses, proven by evidence. She turned to address the whole room. My father has filed 27 formal complaints against Mr. Johnson. Every single one was disproven by security footage. He's accused Mr. Johnson of damage that didn't exist, mistakes that never happened, and misconduct that was clearly fabricated. The room was so quiet you could hear the water lapping against the dock outside. Sarah walked closer to her father's table, placing the folder of evidence in front of him. Dad, I've spent my career fighting against discrimination. I never thought I'd have to fight it in my own family, but here we are. Her voice softened slightly. I love you, but what you're doing is wrong. It's illegal. It's morally reprehensible. And it stops today. Wellington stared at the folder, his face a mix of anger and shame. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Sarah interrupted. You've been treating Mr. Johnson differently because of the color of his skin. There's no other explanation. The evidence is overwhelming. She turned back to the room. I'm ashamed that my father has behaved this way, but I'm more ashamed that this community has allowed it to continue. Everyone here saw what was happening. Many of you documented it, but no one stood up to stop it. The silence in the room was deafening. Marina members looked at their plates, uncomfortable with their own complicity. Mrs. Patterson, the marina manager, sat with tears in her eyes. So here's what happens next, Sarah continued, her lawyer's training evident in her tone. Either my father makes a public apology to Mr. Johnson and changes his behavior immediately, or I will file a formal discrimination lawsuit against him and against this marina for allowing the harassment to continue. She looked directly at her father. Your choice, Dad, but know this, if you choose to continue this behavior, you're not just risking your reputation and your marina membership. You're risking your relationship with your daughter. The room held its breath, waiting for Richard Wellington's response. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no going back. The days following the Yacht Club dinner were unusually quiet at Newport Bay Harbor. Richard Wellington's pride sat untouched at its birth, its owner notably absent. Sarah had returned to San Francisco, leaving behind a community struggling to process what had happened and a father facing his own painful truths. On the fourth morning after the confrontation, Wellington appeared at the marina. He looked different, somehow smaller, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. He found Marcus in his office, reviewing the day's maintenance schedules. Mr. Johnson, Wellington said quietly, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. May I come in? Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He noticed that for the first time, Wellington was asking for permission rather than barging in with demands. I've been thinking, Wellington began, sitting heavily in the chair across from Marcus's desk. Sarah showed me all the videos, every single one. She made me watch them 3 times. He paused, running a hand over his face. I kept trying to justify it to myself, to explain it away, but seeing it all together like that. Marcus remained silent, letting Wellington continue. Outside the office window, several boat owners pretended not to watch while obviously paying close attention to the interaction. I've always considered myself a successful man, Wellington continued. I built my business from nothing. I thought that gave me the right to demand perfection, to be harsh with people who didn't meet my standards. He looked down at his hands. But Sarah helped me see that my standards weren't really about performance at all. Mrs. Chen walked by the office window for the 3rd time, not even pretending to have a destination anymore. Judge Peterson had mysteriously found some urgent maintenance to do on his boat, giving him a clear view of Marcus's office. The truth is, Wellington's voice cracked slightly. I've been carrying around prejudices I didn't even want to admit to myself. When Sarah showed me the contrast, how I treated you versus how I treated others doing the exact same things, he shook his head. I was disgusted with myself. For the first time in their interactions, Wellington looked directly into Marcus's eyes without any hint of superiority or disdain. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. I know those words aren't enough to make up for my behavior, but they're a start. I've spent the past few days really examining myself, my attitudes, my assumptions. It's been uncomfortable, painful even, but necessary. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Mr. Wellington, I appreciate you saying this. Please, Wellington interrupted. Call me Richard, and I'm not finished. He pulled out a folder from his jacket. I've written formal letters to the Marina Management and the Harbor Board, withdrawing all my complaints against you. I've also, he hesitated, I've enrolled myself in diversity and sensitivity training. Sarah helped me find a good program. Outside the office, the crowd of busy boat owners had grown. Tom, the security guard, had positioned himself nearby, ready to intervene if needed, but the tension in his shoulders eased as he observed the conversation's tone. I know I can't undo what I've done, Wellington continued, but I can change my behavior going forward. I'm asking for the chance to prove that change is possible, not for forgiveness. I haven't earned that yet, but for the opportunity to do better. Marcus considered Wellington's words carefully. He had faced discrimination throughout his career, but this was the first time someone had acknowledged their prejudice and committed to change so directly. Mr. Richard, Marcus replied, change is always possible for those willing to do the work. Your actions going forward will speak louder than any words today. Wellington nodded, standing up slowly. I understand. And Mr. Johnson, you're an excellent dock manager. The best this marina has ever had. I should have seen that from the beginning, if I hadn't been so blinded by my own prejudice. As Wellington left the office, the gathered crowd quickly dispersed, pretending they hadn't been watching. But word of the conversation spread quickly through the marina community. Most people were skeptical. Change rarely comes easily to those set in their ways. But over the next few weeks, they began to notice small differences. Wellington started greeting Marcus with genuine respect each morning. He began acknowledging his own mistakes instead of blaming others. When new boat owners arrived at the marina, he was overheard praising Marcus's expertise and professionalism. Small steps, perhaps, but significant ones for a man confronting and dismantling his own deeply rooted prejudices. The transformation wasn't just in Wellington. The entire marina community began to examine their own behavior, their silence, their complicity, their failure to stand up against obvious discrimination. Sometimes it takes one person's courage to help others find their own. 3 months after Sarah Wellington's confrontation with her father, Newport Bay Harbor had become a different place. The change was visible in both small daily interactions and larger systemic improvements. On this particular morning, Marcus Johnson stood at the end of Dhaka, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Richard Wellington's voice came from behind him. The dock owner approached with 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Marcus. This had become their morning ritual over the past few weeks, a simple gesture that symbolized a deeper transformation. Thank you, Richard, Marcus said, accepting the coffee. They stood in comfortable silence, watching early morning boats head out for fishing. 3 months ago, such a peaceful moment between them would have seemed impossible. The marina's transformation had rippled far beyond just Wellington's change of heart. Mrs. Patterson, inspired by recent events, had worked with the Harbor Board to implement new anti-discrimination policies. Every staff member and boat owner now signed a code of conduct that specifically addressed harassment and discrimination. The policies, drafted with Sarah's legal expertise, had become a model for other marinas along the coast. The Harbor Board meeting went well yesterday, Wellington mentioned, sipping his coffee. They'd approved your proposal for the Youth Maritime Education Program. Marcus nodded, feeling proud. The program had been his dream, offering underprivileged kids the chance to learn about boating and marine careers. Wellington had not only supported the idea but had become its biggest advocate, pledging substantial funding through his company. Down the dock, Mrs. Chen was teaching a group of local high school students about sailing knots. The marina's new community outreach programs have brought fresh energy to the previously exclusive atmosphere. Judge Peterson, now head of the marina's diversity committee, was organizing monthly events that brought together people from all walks of life who shared a love for the water. Sarah's coming this weekend, Wellington said, his voice warm with pride. She's bringing some of her law firm colleagues to talk about expanding the internship program. The marina had started offering paid internships to law students interested in maritime law and civil rights, another initiative that had grown from the summer's events. Tom, the security guard, walked past on his morning rounds, exchanging friendly greetings with both men. The security team had received additional training in recognizing and reporting discrimination, though such incidents had become rare at Newport Bay Harbor. You know, Wellington said thoughtfully, I was terrified of change. I thought maintaining the status quo meant keeping standards high. He shook his head. I couldn't have been more wrong. Real excellence comes from inclusion, from different perspectives and experiences. Marcus looked around at the busy marina. New faces were everywhere. Diverse staff members, boat owners from various backgrounds, community members who previously felt unwelcome. The harbor's reputation had actually improved, attracting people who appreciated its commitment to equality and professionalism. Later that morning, during the staff meeting, Marcus presented plans for the upcoming winter season. Wellington sat quietly among other boat owners, taking notes and offering constructive suggestions when asked. The fear and tension that had once filled these meetings was gone, replaced by genuine collaboration. I have an announcement, Mrs. Patterson said near the meeting's end. The American Marina Association has asked us to present our anti-discrimination policies at their annual conference. They want to make our programs a national standard. The room burst into applause. Marcus caught Wellington's eye across the table, seeing genuine happiness there. Both men knew that their story, one of confrontation, accountability, and transformation, had become something larger than themselves. After the meeting, a new boat owner approached Marcus. I heard about what happened here last summer, she said. That's why I chose this marina. Real change is rare, but when it happens, it's worth supporting. As the day drew to a close, Marcus stood at his office window, watching the sunset reflect off Wellington's pride. The yacht's name had taken on a different meaning now, pride not in exclusion or superiority, but in growth, in admitting mistakes, in doing better. Sarah's weekly check-in email popped up on his computer screen. She had attached photos of other marinas implementing similar programs, proving that positive change could spread far beyond one dock, one harbor, or one community. Sometimes it just took one person willing to stand up, another willing to change, and a community ready to support them both. The harbor lights began to twinkle on as dusk settled. Marcus smiled, thinking about how far they'd come. The past couldn't be erased, but the future, that was something they were building together, one day at a time.